3, 2, 1.
Hello, attendees. Thank you for coming to our event. We'll get started in about 1 minute, but this is the Ideal Russian Interference Election event. We're very excited to have everyone. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I think we'll probably have some more people filter in as we're going. But welcome to Ideal's event on 2016 Russian interference and the future of election interference. My name is Amanda, and I am a student at Johns Hopkins University and the Director of Education for Ideal. Ideal is a nonpartisan political student organization, and we work to help bring people together to have informed discussions about current events, as well as raise civic engagement across the student population. This evening, we have an amazing group of panelists and an amazing moderator, and we hope that you get a better understanding of what happened in 2016, what is happening in 2020, as well as some tangible takeaways that help you during this voting season. We also want to remind all of our audience to please make sure that you go out and vote to cast your ballot, whether that's voting in person early, mailing in your ballot, or voting on election day itself. We encourage you to check out Hopkins Votes if you want to create a voting plan for yourself. So for this webinar, we'll be using the Q&A function. The chat function is disabled for attendees, but if you have any questions for our panelists, we will be having an audience Q&A section at the end of the event. So please feel free to drop your questions in there and we'll get to them towards the end. And I'm going to kick us off by introducing our moderator. So our moderator is Professor Adam Sheingate from the Political Science Department at Johns Hopkins University. His most recent book is Building a Business of Politics, The Rise of Political Consulting with the Transformation of American Democracy. He is also a co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Historical Institutionalism and the author of The Rise of the Agricultural Welfare State Institutions and Interest Group Power in the United States, France, and Japan, as well as journal articles and book chapters on American political development, historical institutionalism, and comparative public policy. Thank you so much, Professor Sheingate. We're so excited to have you moderate this discussion tonight. Oh, I believe you're on mute.
Sorry, this is my first Zoom call. I'm really excited to be here and be participating in this terrific panel, and it's my privilege to introduce a really distinguished group of panelists. So I'm going to briefly introduce everybody, and then we're going to go directly to some questions that I'll ask specific panelists. And once we've gone through that sort of round robin, then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So to begin, we have Scott Shane. He was a reporter from 2004 to 2019 in the Washington Bureau of the New York Times, writing on national security and other issues. He's the recipient of a Pulitzer Prize twice, once in 2017 and again in 2018, with Times colleagues for coverage of the Russian interference in the 2016 election, as well as related topics. His 2015 book, Objective Troy, A Terrorist, a President, and the Rise of the Drone, examines the life and death of the late American-born radical cleric Anwar al-Awlaki, killed in a drone strike in Yemen in 2011 at the orders of President Obama. In addition to the debate over terrorism and targeted killing, he's written on Hillary Clinton and the intervention in Libya, Saudi influence on global Islam, the National Security Agency, and Edward Snowden's leaked documents, WikiLeaks and confidential State Department cables, and the Obama administration's prosecution of leaks of classified information. And he's currently a visiting fellow at the Johns Hopkins SNF Agora Institute. We also have Dr. Avi Rubin, who's professor of computer science and technical director of the Information Security Institute at Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Rubin has focused most of his professional career on the security of electronic voting. He was director of the NSF Accurate Center for Secure Elections, and he served as a Maryland elections judge in 6 elections. He's testified widely about the security of voting machines, both before the House, US, and Senate on multiple occasions, and he's the author of several books about computer security, including Brave New Ballot. In January 2004, Baltimore Magazine named Rubin a Baltimorean of the Year for his work in safeguarding the integrity of our election process. And he's also the recipient of the 2004 Electronic Frontiers Foundation Pioneer Award. We also have Robert Johnston with us tonight. While working for the cybersecurity company Crowdstrike, Robert Johnston identified and discovered the existence of Russian malware in the Democratic National Committee's computer systems. Many of the documents and emails obtained through the hack were inevitably leaked by the Russian government, as we all know, and as we'll talk about more this evening. Mr. Johnston is currently co-founder and CEO of Adlumin, the leading security and compliance automation platform in the United States. Before joining the private sector, Mr. Johnston served as an officer in the United States Marine Corps, and as a Marine officer, he was the team lead of 81 National Cyber Protection Team. This is the Cyber National Mission Force, as well as the director of the Marine Corps Red Team. His team was responsible for countering the Russian penetration of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Pentagon. And then joining us all the way from London, where it's a little bit after midnight, is Peter Pomerantsev. He is a senior fellow at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University, where he co-directs the ARENA initiative. Between 2017 and 2020, he was a senior fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science, where he was the director there of the ARENA initiative, which is a research project dedicated to overcoming the challenges of digital era disinformation and polarization. His book on Russian propaganda, entitled Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, won the 2016 Royal Society of Literature Ondaatje Prize and was nominated for the Samuel Johnson Guardian First Book, Pushkin House, and Gordon Burns Prizes. It's been translated into over a dozen languages and has been dramatized on BBC Radio 4. His newest book, This Is Not Propaganda, was released in August 2019 and has been shortlisted for the Gordon Burns Prize and was named a Times Book of the Year. Mr. Pomerantsev has also testified on the challenges of information war and media development in the US House Foreign Affairs Committee, the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and the UK Parliament Defence Select Committee. So it truly is a spectacular group. Welcome to all of you. I'm really looking forward to getting right into our discussion. And as I said at the outset, what I'd like to do is just ask each of you to briefly respond to a quick opening question that'll give you each an opportunity to say a little bit about how we should think about 2016 and how we should think about 2020 in light of 2016. And then at that point, we can open it up for a wider discussion with some questions from the audience. So if I could start with you, Scott, I think it would be helpful if you could just very briefly kind of give us the thumbnail sketch to remind us of the main features of the interference campaign from 2016. And maybe as we now, 4 years later, maybe some of the misperceptions we have about what actually happened in 2016.
Okay, sure. Thanks, Adam, and thanks for Ideal for having me on the panel today. So I think of the Russian attack on the 2016 election, the US election, as having 3 elements. One was hacking and leaking. And of course, Robert Johnston knows much more about the hacking, but the Russian military intelligence agency, the GRU, hacked the Democratic National Committee its sister organization, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, and John Podesta's Gmail, John Podesta being Hillary Clinton's campaign chairman. And they took those emails, gave them to WikiLeaks eventually, and WikiLeaks dumped them before the Democratic National Convention. And then the Podesta emails were dribbled out for the whole last month of the campaign. The second, so there was hacking and leaking. The second element was social media influence campaign. That was mostly, the GRU had a little bit to do with that, but it was mostly run by a private company called the Internet Research Agency, whose owner really put it, to the service of the Russian government. And they created thousands of fake Facebook profiles, Twitter profiles. They used just about every social media platform there is, including Vine. They created a couple of podcasts, and all of this, most of it on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, was to sort of mimic existing interest groups in the across the American political spectrum. And I guess there were three goals of this social media campaign. One was to attack, I think number one really was to attack Hillary Clinton, who Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, kind of had it in for. The second was to boost Donald Trump. And the third was to just pour gasoline on the flames of our existing political divisions. And the final part, which is less well explored, less well understood, but certainly appears to have happened, was to throw a bunch of Russians at various members of the Trump campaign and Trump circle to see if they could do any good. They could sort of size up the Trump operation. He was a newcomer to politics, of course, and see if they could win over anybody in his circles as an agent of influence, or even an agent. These are people, in many cases, who we had barely heard of course, like Carter Page and George Papadopoulos. So that was the third part, was sort of the human intelligence, the HUMINT operation. And, I think to very briefly touch on impact, the hacking and leaking definitely had a remarkable impact. People may remember that Debbie Wasserman Schultz, the chairwoman of the Democratic Party, was forced to resign on the eve of the convention by the emails that were leaked from the DNC. They also split the fired up the Bernie Sanders supporters who demonstrated on the floor of the convention against Clinton, against the DNC. So that was quite effective on their part. And I think in October of 2016, the Podesta emails also had quite an impact, because they put them out every couple days, and they included speeches that Hillary Clinton had given to banks and corporations that she had declined to release herself. And Trump grabbed juicy little tidbits from those speeches and made great use of them on the campaign trail. So I think it definitely had a major impact, and no one can say whether it made the difference in a very close election, but I think it would be foolish to say it had no impact. So that's 2016.
I think I'm mute again, Adam.
Yeah, thank you. It's I'm getting better. Tell me, Scott, something about are there misperceptions that we might have about what happened, or things maybe we've forgotten 4 years later?
I think I'm not sure there's misperceptions. There's an ongoing debate about significance. Many people have essentially deprecated the impact of this social media campaign. It did reach some impressive sounding numbers. Facebook eventually estimated that it had that the Internet Research Agency material had shown up in the Facebook feeds of, I think it was 129 million Americans, which is roughly the number that voted in 2016. And I think another 20 million on Instagram. So the numbers were quite significant. I guess I'd personally, I think one aspect of this that people often fail to consider is a thought experiment, and that is, imagine Vladimir Putin had it in for Donald Trump and really loved Hillary Clinton and had chosen, bet on the other horse. I'm guessing that Donald Trump and his campaign did not have state-of-the-art cybersecurity, that the GRU would have had just as much success, if not more. And imagine if the documents about Trump's payoffs to women, he'd had affairs with, Trump's taxes, God knows what, had been leaked during the campaign, and we hadn't gotten any of the DNC or the Clinton material. I think there you can see. So you kind of have to measure impact, not just from the 0 point, but a kind of active decision of Putin to choose the side that he chose. And when you think about it that way, I think the impact was quite impressive. And I think maybe more than anything, it was sort of proof of concept to be as brazen as that, carry out an attack like that on the US at the heart of its sort of, our self-perception. Democracy, elections are kind of our brand. To without hiding your tracks terribly carefully, to attack the US in that way and suffer some sanctions, but kind of going on about your business. And even the Internet Research Agency is still around and working on 2020, according to US intelligence agencies. So I suppose it showed many countries the value of these tools, maybe their limitations as well, and sort of kind of opened a whole new arena for influence operations that had been previously limited to much smaller operations within Russia, within the former Soviet Union, within Eastern Europe.
Thanks. That's perfect, and actually a great segue to bring in Peter Pomerantsev into this discussion. And Peter, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about what 2016 or how 2016 was of a piece with, say, broader Russian goals and strategy, and then as Scott was saying about the kind of the ways in which Putin and Putin's regime has kind of developed propaganda, misinformation, and other tactics to accomplish his goals, both within Russia, but also in terms of exercising a wider sphere of influence.
Wow, I mean, that's a great question. Yeah, for those of us who've been watching Kremlin, I mean, it's much more than propaganda that we're talking about here. Kind of like, should we say, in information operations and another non-kinetic means of influence develop over the last kind of, well, I suppose over the last decade, really. I don't want to belittle it, but the American operation felt like a kind of a playful scratch compared to, for example, Estonia. I'm going to get the year wrong. It's going to be so embarrassing. It is past midnight here. I think 2007, yes. Or even earlier. The Kremlin wages an operation which contains kind of an information operation to stir up kind of ethnic tension in Estonia, a cyber attack which takes out the Estonian parliament, I think, newspapers and financial system for a day. So I mean, they take out the country's infrastructure for a day, basically. And there's also sort of incitement to violence and violence on the streets with unproven but highly suspicious activity by kind of pro-Russian groups. And Estonia had a day of violence based around ethnic tension, a day where it's newspapers, banks, and parliament were knocked out. So when you compare that to the American situation, it's much bigger and much more dangerous. And so people in the kind of what's sometimes known as the frontline states have been aware of this for a while. And there's something very important going on here, in the sense that, look, even if we talk about the West in any kind of meaningful way, as opposed to like Western civilization or all these very contentious terms, but it basically means like NATO, that's basically what it is. largely. I mean, it's basically the idea that, you know, a bunch of countries will defend each other if attacked. And the great challenge of the sort of activity the Kremlin is doing is that all of it comes well under kind of what's known as the threshold of Article 5, the sort of the threshold of an attack. And it's kind of blurring the lines. Like, is this a war? Is this, you know, just sort of like, you know, is this propaganda, which feels much thinner? What is this? And kind of our inability not to place it, I think, is what makes it so kind of, you know, intellectually interesting, but also kind of challenging. What's the doctrine? How do you respond to a troll attack? I mean, what do we do? Let off stink bombs and you catch a bug? I mean, what is the game we're meant to go into? What is like the symmetric or asymmetric reaction of this new kind of conflict, which is both kind of dangerous and nefarious and yet not open warfare? And look, we're going to be seeing a lot of this. In that sense, I think the Russians have kind of twigged something about globalization. It's not going to be just people coming together across borders to exchange information. It's going to actually be this very kind of weird place where we're both kind of too integrated to go to war with each other, but yet a lot of kind of sniping each other underneath the covers. I think we'll see a lot more from China. I mean, they kind of sniffed that out, you know, because at the end of the day, in terms of the punishment, even for Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you know, Russian oil and gas is still flowing to Europe. You know, they've been very good at knowing that line where they can just about still be a part of globalization and yet do a lot of very, very, very kind of aggressive things. So that might not be quite the only question that you're looking for, but I think that's the big significance of what they're doing. It's this gray zone that they're operating in. In terms of strategies, a lot of it was kind of, we saw it within Russia first, in terms of kind of, you know, creating a propaganda that was targeted at different audiences, that played different segments of the population off each other, rather than trying to dominate them with one single ideology. That definitely was developing inside of Russia. And the troll farms that, you know, the Internet Research Agency that launched the very hard to determine in its effectiveness, but quite spectacular in its brazenness, social media campaign in America, it was first kind of, I don't know if it was created for it, but it was first became known for attacking opposition in Russia. So, you know, that was already a well-known story inside of Russia. So yeah, I mean, they have been building up the capabilities for a while, but there is a bigger kind of question that they're asking. And we can get into the details of you know, what one does about it, because it's actually very hard.
Thanks. That's really great. And it also, I kind of want to sort of pivot now. And I think part of what's so fascinating about this discussion is that, you know, some of the things that Peter, that you just described, you know, sound, you know, very contemporary, very new, you know, the ability to take down the cyber infrastructure of a country. But at the same time, there's also a way in which Russia is basically taking very old methods. I mean, propaganda has been around for quite some time, and sort of, and so it's interesting to think about how the sort of techniques of propaganda meet the kind of contemporary technological tools. And so at that, I want to sort of pivot a little bit to these technology of cyber warfare and bring Richard into the discussion, and maybe to give us a little bit more about the specific sort of security vulnerabilities that allowed Russia to exploit I guess the DNC in 2016. Is it just as simple as, you know, don't click on the phishing link, or is there something more to it? But, you know, tell us a little bit about the main tools in the Russian arsenal. And then I guess what we all want to know is, are we safer than we were 4 years ago with respect to some of these actions?
Yeah, great, Adam. Thanks so much for the opportunity. You know, when I look at my experience in 2016 running the investigation at the Democratic National Committee, really, I don't look at it as a technical failure on anyone's part. It is almost an organizational or institutional failure. Like hacking elections wasn't something new, even here in the United States in 2016. Many people don't know, but the Obama campaign, both in 2008 and in 2012, was penetrated by the Chinese. For as long as 2008, political campaigns have been heavy targets of nation state adversaries throughout the world. So it's not like the DNC or the RNC, the Republicans or the Democrats didn't know that their political organizations could be a target. I think they, they significantly underestimated the importance of that target. When you look at the DNC or even the RNC as an organization, it's not a government agency, it's a nonprofit. They have money problems just like anyone else. So if you'd asked, like, does the DNC have the best in class security tools that are on the market? No, of course not. They don't have the money that Bank of America has, or JP Morgan, or the talent that they could put behind their security systems to make them effective. They had 6 people who work in IT that were not only responsible for security, but they were responsible for making sure that the lowest level intern had Word installed on his laptop. Like, you can imagine how thinly spread those individuals are. And these nonprofit organizations, which is what they are, although they may raise billions of dollars, those billions of dollars are for campaigns, not for a security system. So you definitely have, an institutional failure that's there at the technical level. They weren't technically prepared to thwart an attack from a nation state attacker like the Russian GRU or Russian SVR. When I look at the technical implementation of the attack itself, the DNC certainly wasn't my first experience with those Russian state actors, specifically SVR, which is like the Russian CIA. In this particular case, I had just been on an investigation 6 months prior to that at the SVR penetration of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the Pentagon. So this was like my second round with at least the Russian SVR within a 6-month time period. And from a technical perspective, what they were doing was not all that sophisticated. I always have described both the GRU and the SVR as their operational capabilities are very sophisticated, but their technical tools are not. They used a lot of open source tools, which make it hard to attribute. They used a lot of high order programming languages like Python, which anyone can learn to develop in, but traditionally that's not what you see, the world's most advanced sophisticated rootkit that's never supposed to be found by anybody, like the USA was caught using, right? And so it wasn't that level of sophistication at all. I mean, it was a lot of open source tools, it was a lot of noise, a lot of very aggressive snatch and grab. But what they were, I think, really, really good at was targeting. They knew who to target inside the DNC organization itself. They knew who the head of research was. They knew who the head of opposition research was. They knew who, Amy Dacey, the CEO of the DNC, Debbie Wasserman Schultz. They knew how to find their computers very quickly. They knew where to go to the email servers and the document file servers to collect documents and files very, very quickly. And they learned to do that very effectively, and then both take that information back to Russia, consume it, presumably thousands and thousands and thousands of pages, consume it very, very effectively, and then obviously come up with a very quick and very effective plan to distribute it, both using, Guccifer 2.0, which, is a moniker to the Guccifer 1.0, who sits in prison, a Romanian, just a way to kind of create a layer of separation between the GRU and who was and the American public, as well as WikiLeaks. And so that's where I think their sophistication level really rose to a nation state level capability. Russia is certainly known for much more capable malware. Like, there's a malware group out there called Snake, which develops in a much lower level language. It's much harder to find. You're talking like rootkit, bootkits, things that aren't easily recognizable on the system. Very, very, very silent and stealthy stuff. And that certainly was not the purpose in this particular case. But their operational tempo, their capability to get what they need, but more importantly, I think find what they need, is what is rises to a very, very sophisticated level. When it comes to the 2020 elections, are we more prepared now? Scott labeled it very, very well, putting it kind of in 3 buckets, or 2016 in 3 buckets. You had the technical hacking of the DNC and the distribution of the looted content from the Democratic National Committee. You had influence operations through media channels and a human operation. I think as we look at America in 2020, we're a lot more aware, just as a general public, that this is a thing. Everyone should be aware, down to even probably the lowest educated voter knows at some level to be aware of Russian disinformation, whether it's right or wrong. In fact, I think today in 2020, you probably have, the pendulum has swung too far the other direction. Everything looks like a Russian influence operation, and I think in somewhat you're seeing that play out with Hunter Biden's laptop, and the intelligence community saying, like, we have no evidence of this being Russia anything at all, but the pendulum has swung the other way. Everything looks like Russian disinformation when in actuality, some things may be, some things may not be. So the general public is more aware. Are the individual organizations like the DNC and the RNC more prepared? I think so. I think they've learned to open their budgets a little bit and purchase a little better security tools. But also, I would hope that people have learned to just be a little bit more careful in email. And this is what I love about email as an active operation weapon, right? Is because inherently people are not careful in emails. Prior to 2016, there was probably this expected level of privacy in an email conversation between two people. But anytime emails are leaked, you would look at Sony when they leaked emails, from the North Korean, the Sony hack, where you had these actors that were, saying all these ridiculous things and making fun of people in emails. Like, people just inherently are not careful in emails. And Hillary Clinton, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, Bernie Sanders, they are also all not careful in email, just like the rest of us are, right? And they say things that they may not mean, or they say things that they never intended to become public. So I think that in 2020, we are better off in 2016, and we're better off from a general awareness of the American public. I think we're better off from an action standard of operations at like the Facebook and Twitter level. Like, these people have stood up quite large organizations within their companies to counter disinformation, to make sure they're staying out ahead of it. But again, I really think the pendulum has swung, the other direction, too far in the other direction, which, in retrospect is like a little bit of a natural reaction, where they're muting posts that probably shouldn't be muted. The most recent one in mind is probably, the Hunter Biden, laptop posts. Like, they're taking drastic action because they felt like they had a little bit of a black eye in 2016, and they would rather go a little bit too far in the other direction than not go far enough, which is fair. I think for especially for a private company, you would expect a little bit of an overcorrection. But because of those things, I think we are better off in 2020, and don't think the US hasn't been setting the battle space either. Since 2016, we've run a variety of counter influence operations, both in the 2018 midterms. We've launched our own information operations. The NSA launched their own set of information operations against the Internet Research Agency, against people who were looking like they were going to try and influence the 2018 midterms. They took down recently, Microsoft and the NSA took down a huge botnet that they thought might be used to affect the US elections. And so since 2016, I think we've taken a much more aggressive role from a government, intelligence community, and military perspective to let people know that America is not going to stand for this kind of action, and we're gonna punch you back this time if you think you can repeat 2016 again. So we've put up the warning flags and we've prepared the home battle space. I do think at a macro level we're far better prepared in 2020 than of course we were in 2016.
Great, thanks. So before we move to audience questions, I do want to bring Avi Rubin into the conversation, and maybe drilling down more specifically into characteristics or vulnerabilities of our electoral system, as opposed to the broader kind of political environment that we've been talking about so far. And so I guess Avi, you've been working on these issues for so long. If you could again, for probably the millionth time, just tell us the most important vulnerabilities that you see. But obviously, the question is whether, over time, are we getting better? Are we getting worse? Are we pretty much staying the same? Maybe certainly in the last 4 years, but overall, in terms of protecting the electoral system from mischief.
Sure. So I think that the vulnerabilities that we've been listening to so far about the influence, the social media, the public opinion, those may ultimately have a more pronounced effect on the outcome of the election than the security of the electoral technology itself. Back in 2004, I think was the first election where we had widespread use of electronic voting machines. And I believe, and I think the computer science community in general believed, that that was a very risky proposition, using fully electronic machines that were programmed by individuals who didn't necessarily have background checks. And furthermore, the inspection of the machines that was done showed that they were built very poorly, without good software engineering practices. And I think 2008 was pretty bad as well. We didn't know of any major compromise that happened. It is possible that one could happen without us knowing it, but there were no indications such as exit polls completely out of whack with precincts. So we don't believe that there was a major compromise of those electronic voting machines. The good thing that we know, though, is that since then, most of the states have moved away from those and back to paper ballots. In 2004, 37 states had no paper trail, fully electronic voting. Now it's down to about a dozen. And the big story really is this year, because of COVID, the paper ballots by mail. And interestingly, I believe that from a security perspective, this is much better than voting on voting machines. There are some social scientists who have social aspects that they're concerned about, such as voter coercion and vote selling and other things. But most of the attacks that are possible against vote by mail are retail attacks, meaning you have to go to a particular spot and perform your malicious action, but you can't do a wholesale attack like you can with the electronic systems. So wholesale fraud is a lot harder. Now there's concerns about the president saying, that he's casting doubt on vote by mail's integrity and saying there's fraud there, but there's absolutely no evidence. And in fact, there's plenty of evidence that voting by mail is very resistant to fraud and is a better voting system. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. One of the biggest problems we may have with vote by mail is not security, but just voters making mistakes, because different states are going to apply different standards to what constitutes a valid ballot. Some states have voter intent laws where they're going to say, well, we're going to look at the ballot, and if the person signed in the wrong place, but they still signed, we know what they intended to do. Some states are extremely strict, and they say, okay, if you didn't dot this I, then this ballot is no good. And it's all over the spectrum of what constitutes a ballot that's going to count is different. And it's going to create, I think, some controversy. They're going to be rejected ballots, and it's going to be publicly known that that happened. So in 2020, we're not talking about, hackers and rigged voting machines and electronic voting machines. We talked a lot about that 10 years ago, but today we're talking about what are the standards for whether a mail-in ballot counts. And there's still going to be a lot of poll site voting. And the interesting thing that I've read and understand is that the Democrats tend to be the people that are going to be voting more by mail. And so those ballots will be received. And some states will count them early and some will wait till election day. And Republicans are more likely to vote on election day at the polls. And so we may see a situation where we get a particular result and then we see that the result starts to change dramatically on election day, which could bring out theories that there was some tampering when it may not have happened. And so it's going to be interesting. And this is going to be an election like no other. And I can't predict what's going to happen. I've already voted, I mailed in my vote, and I'm going to sit back now and wait and see how we handle this.
Thanks, Avi. That's great. And maybe as we open it up to, we might come back to sort of what possibilities are there for Russian or other bad actors to take advantage of a period of uncertainty right at the on election day and in the days afterwards in the scenario that you just outlined. So we might come back to that. But let me hand it back over to Amanda, who I think should have some questions from the audience.
Yeah, great. And I want to encourage audience members to please type your questions in the Q&A section of Zoom. The first question that we have is, do you think that, and I think it's mostly directed to Mr. Pomerantsev, do you think that the way we understand these attacks as propaganda or as acts of war is changing? And in the future, will it be more likely that we see these information attacks as acts of war and perhaps like as they grow in scale and perhaps frequency, like will we see this as more so speaking to Article 5, which you spoke about earlier? Oh, I believe you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. I believe maybe some elements of cyber are actually starting to be included in Article 5. I'm not a war expert, but I know there's been a process around that. At what moment does an actual kind of attack on infrastructure become something like actual aggression? But with the information stuff, which is the stuff that I focus on much more, I think it would be very dangerous for us very damaging to democracy if we start looking at information as somehow inherently like a weapon. I think that's a very I think that's kind of very in working the tradition of any kind of democratic ideals, and the consequences of that could actually play into the hands of those who want to, reinstall a world of censorship and of closed information spaces. So I don't think we should give up on the ideals of 1989, the ideals of information flowing across borders quite yet. I think maybe we should move, when we're thinking about these kind of digital operations, I think one useful way of thinking about it is to think about disinformation much less about the content that we're dealing with, because the content is often neutral or even true, but in kind of like the behavior that gets that content out there online. So we're talking about kind of mass covert bot armies, various ways of gaming, search engine optimization, forms of very non-transparent targeting. So the internet isn't really about content, it's about scale and delivery. That's what makes the internet so unique and so different to other forms that we've had in the past. So in the sense that we should think about regulation, I think we have to think about it in that space. What do we think? Do we want regulation around certain types of what the platforms now call coordinated inauthentic behaviors? So that kind of like mass troll farm activity, 10,000 accounts which pretend to be real people in America but are actually one person in St. Petersburg. Should that kind of behavior be allowed? That would mean kind of, I think, outlawing that kind of behavior both at home and abroad, but it would at least be based around some sort of normative framework. And then you can go, obviously we welcome the opinions of the Russian states in the spirit of open debate and open information flowing across borders, but we do have a problem with these covert dodgy operations, and we have standards around that. We have standards around that at home, we have standards around that for foreign actors. So that would be the ideal, bringing in a kind of a sense of rules and common norms which are the same for everyone. So that I think from a regulatory point of view, that's the way the information bit probably needs to go. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be unaware that the other side does see this as a form of warfare. That's the way they do conceive of it. So that doesn't mean we should be lackadaisical. We do have to be very, very aware. But there's lots of things that you can do before we get to kind of declarations of war in order to deal with this. In a very simple way, it's also about understanding what are the diplomatic levers. I mean, if they do this stuff, what is the answer that we give to sort of what's the thing that we can threaten with that will be off-putting? We have had cases of the Russians, for example, hacking the German Bundestag and then not leaking the material. So we assume that the German government said, look, if you do this, the consequence will be ABC. And the Russians just going, nah, it's not worth it. So I think there's a lot of diplomatic space there before we get to kind of the full war discussion.
That's great. Yeah, and I'm seeing a lot of questions, kind of to switch topics, if you will, in the chat that are kind of focusing on the relationship between three main actors in this situation. So the public sector, the private sector, and then the general American electorate. And so I want to ask a question that's kind of popped up in several different ways in the chat, which is, what is the role of the public sector, for example, the FBI, versus private companies in investigating and fighting cyber attacks? And I think when we think about private companies, we can, of course, think about cybersecurity companies, but we can also think about social media companies like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, who are also wherein people are also spreading this content on their platform. So what's the relationship between the public sector and the private sector in investigating and fighting these attacks? And then the second question is there a decline in trust in the public sector or in the private sector based on the handling of the 2016 election? And what does this relationship look like in terms of how the general public views these actors? So I think, let's see, Mr. Johnston, if you want to start by answering
Sure.
this question.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you look at the mismatch in resources and skills, I don't think anyone would have the expectation that the Democratic National Committee or anyone should have the expectation that the Democratic National Committee or the DCCC, the Congressional Campaign Committee, should be able to stop an attack or thwart an attack from the Russian GRU, the Russian intelligence services. I mean, the skill mismatch, the resources mismatch is just huge. And because of that, and that goes for almost any company, like it's pretty hard to expect, any private company to be able to thwart or put up a fight against such incredibly resourced people. Because, if the Russian GRU wants you bad enough and they want to spend $1 billion in order to compromise your organization, they'll spend $1 billion to sink it if they want it that bad. And where a private company cannot spend $1 billion in order to stop you. So that puts the role of government, I think, as the primary defenders in this particular case, where those two resources can be aligned or at least equal, or we have the opportunity to outpace them. And so when it comes to the FBI being the primary domestic intelligence collection agency, as well as the federal domestic law enforcement agency, there are a few others that are, I think, in my humble opinion, slightly less capable, like the Secret Service and things like that, than the FBI. The primary responsibility falls on their shoulders in order to defend these organizations, who in large part are helpless at defending themselves.
And then Mr. Shane, maybe you can speak about how we rebuild trust in the American public in these institutions, and like how that relationship has changed since 2016 and what it looks like now in 2020.
Sure. Well, let me address the other part of that first question, which is the social media companies. They've gone through several phases. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and so on were, when they were created, they tried to sustain a model in which they said, we're just the platform. Don't blame us for anything that anybody should put on our platform. We're just the bottle. Don't bother us about what goes inside the bottle, what somebody else puts inside the bottle. And it was also, they were seen as a fairly benign force. It's hard to remember these days, but of course, initially it was sort of the way you tracked down your old friends from high school and kept in touch with grandma and so on. And then in 2011, they got a whole lot of positive publicity during the Arab Awakening, the Arab Spring, as a tool that opponents of dictatorial regimes could use to organize demonstrations and keep in touch and evade the authorities and so on. And that seems like a long time ago. But 2016, I think, was the end of that sort of halcyon era for those companies, where they could continue to not take responsibility for content and continue to be seen as a force for good and a force for democracy. Suddenly they were being exploited both by foreign actors and by domestic actors. And I think that their CEOs, Mark Zuckerberg, Jack Dorsey, were dragged before Congress and interrogated. Their sort of image with the public took a huge dive. Trust, certainly, which was never terribly high in the government, certainly has plunged for those companies, and they're in a totally new era. And I think it's still very early in the history of those companies. And I think, when you see they have built large, sort of armies of fact checkers, and they're doing much better than they did in 2016 in keeping track of what's going up on their sites. But look at the back and forth over, as Robert pointed out, over the New York Post's stories about, what is possibly Hunter Biden's laptop. They're still sort of tied in knots. They're veering one way and another. There's no sort of standards that they have set and that the public has accepted and that the government has accepted. So, or look at their attempts to rein in Donald Trump. The president of the United States tweets, and sometimes his tweets are marked as misleading or misinformation or disinformation and put behind a kind of wall. Sometimes they're not. But Donald Trump is probably getting more attention than most users of Twitter. So it just seems like we're still at a fairly primitive stage of regulating these engines and understanding what their capabilities are, even though they remain, extremely powerful. If you look at the, there's still, even with the curbs on the New York Post story about Hunter Biden's laptop, it was still the most shared item, despite the fact that it was blocked in many cases. Of the top 10 items shared on Facebook, it was the most shared in the couple days after it went public.
I want to add one thing about the role of the public sector, because if you think about it, the incumbent government is the one that has benefited from the interference. And so they don't really have a strong incentive to try to clamp down on it. And if anything, they would want to encourage it. And I'm not saying that's moral or ethical, but that could be, in terms of incentives, what the behavior would be. So you can't always count on them.
Yeah, that's a really good point that I hadn't thought about. And I think another question to you, Mr. Rubin, I know you answered this in the chat, but I'm really curious, based on all this conversation that we've had about the potentiality of cyber warfare, cyber attacks, the role of technology in elections, what do you imagine the future of voting looks like for the average American voter? Is it possible for us to have online voting? Will we stick to paper ballots and mail-in ballots? What does that look like? And have we learned anything from the 2016 voting situation?
I'm glad you asked that, Amanda, as it gives me a chance to talk about something that I've written quite a bit about and have very strong opinions about. And I could see the temptation to move to internet voting because of the pandemic. It seems like it would be the logical choice. We can all stay in our homes like we're doing now for this panel and cast our votes. But unfortunately, the technology is just not there to make it secure. And I could go on and on about the types of attacks, whether it's against the platform, against the network. A very simple one that people don't think about is, imagine if you're able to degrade or even bring down internet service just for a particular area that tends to vote a certain way. And if 2 or 3% of the people just give up and don't vote, you could have influenced the outcome of the election. But there are much more serious attacks where votes could potentially be changed. People could be brought into the wrong internet site where they think they're voting, and then those votes could just be discarded and they could be given the experience of having voted. On and on. I actually, in my security course, lectured on this recently for 2 hours, so I won't do that to you guys. But bottom line is, we are not ready for internet voting, and we will not be ready anytime soon.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think that you're right. Like, initially I was like, oh, internet voting, it makes sense, COVID-19, reduce health and safety concerns. But although health and safety concerns are obviously important, there are alternatives such as, like you mentioned, mail-in balloting, etc. But we really need to pay attention to also the safety concerns that exist within our electoral system, and how to make sure that the votes that people cast are counted appropriately and counted efficiently, which will be a big deal on not only election night, of course, but also the days and weeks after as well. So I want to Professor Sheingate, thank you to all our audience members who asked questions. This was a wonderful discussion.
Thanks, and certainly want to thank Professor Rubin and everybody else. I do have a kind of a wrap-up question, and I guess maybe it's a sign of a good moderator or a bad moderator to ask a wrap-up question that simply can't be answered. Certainly not in the 5 minutes that we have left. But I think the big question that I'm taking away from this discussion is to try to understand some of the things that make us vulnerable to, particularly if we're thinking about sort of foreign interference, are just characteristics of open societies. And that so long as there's freedom of speech and a democratic political system, that it will present some opportunities for bad actors, for mischief. On the other hand, clearly I think we're doing things ourselves to make us a more attractive target in terms of maybe the level of polarization, perhaps the way in which the current administration is politicizing things like voting. And so I guess I'm curious what you think of that. Again, this is not a question that can be answered easily, but maybe, where do you find yourself walking that line in terms of features that will always be a characteristic of an open society, and things that maybe we should think about how to improve and perhaps protect ourselves from?
Not it.
That's the end of the class, right? No, nobody answers the question.
Well, I will defer this non-technical question to the other panelists.
I would say, well, just in briefly in answer to that very, very broad, kind of profound question, it's heartening, I suppose, in a way, to read the study that said that people over 65 are the most apt to spread false information on Facebook. And certainly in my own experience, I've done some disinformation workshops. I think young people, digital natives as they're called, are much more adept at sort of sniffing out what is true and what is false out there on the internet. So I'm hoping, there's one disinformation expert who has talked about the disinformation vaccination, vaccinating a society. If you look at Ukraine or Estonia, as Peter mentioned, those are societies that are much more at this point, maybe jaundiced and sophisticated about, what you do when you see some wild thing on Facebook. And it's not necessarily to send it to all your friends immediately. So I'm hoping maybe there's a learning curve and that we can maintain an open society while becoming, more adept at sort of navigating this much more hazardous world that we've created for ourselves, that by and large US companies and US technology has created for the world.
Peter, any thoughts?
Yeah, look, I'll because it is a very, it's a question that we need at least another 3 hours to discuss. But to bring it back to something very concrete, there is this, this great line from Goethe's Faust about the evil force that tries to do evil and ends up doing good, and there has been one side positive effect of the Russian campaign. It made us look very, very hard at the role of tech in our societies. I think one of the great moments, has been calling up Mark Zuckerberg, the guys from Google, to the Senate and really as a society interrogating, wow, this is a huge technology that is transforming everything. How does it work? And whether or not, the influence of the Russian online operation is very, very hard to gauge, but that was a consequence of trying to find out what they did. And so in that sense, I do think we have very important questions to ask. What is normal for an open society with regards to the dominance of tech companies? What is abnormal? How much transparency does there have to be around algorithms? What are the rights of people to understand who's targeting them, why they're targeting? What is an open society in this kind of digital age? Because simply thinking about it in terms of a bit of freedom of speech, bit of pluralism, bit of marketplace of ideas, that holy trinity of an open information society is clearly not cutting the mustard in this environment. So the side positive effect has been for us to really question what is an open society in a digital age. And look, we're only just starting to find out. I mean, I have no sympathy with the tech companies, but at the moment, they're getting the Republicans saying, we're going to destroy you because you censor too much. And they've got the Democrats saying, we're going to destroy you because you don't censor. And as a society, like we have a long journey to understand what is the new normal that we want.
Thank you. I think that's maybe a good place to end this conversation and to thank our panelists and to thank Ideal as an organization for bringing together a discussion that I think provides more information about these really core questions, which is really what the organization of Ideal is all about. And so maybe in our small way, we are kind of moving things in the right direction here. So with that, Amanda, thank you for the invitation to participate. Thank you again to all the panelists, and of course to those who attended and who presented us with such great questions. So thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you guys for all coming. We really are so appreciative of the panelists, Professor Sheingate, as well as all our audience members. We also want to thank SNF Agora for partnering with us on this event. As we mentioned earlier, a couple of our panelists are fellows there, and we really appreciate that, as well as allowing us to use their webinar feature to make this all happen for y'all. And we also want to thank Campus YMCA for help promoting it to their constituents as well. A reminder to vote this election season before it's the holiday season. It's of course election season, whether that's in person early, by mail, or on election day. And to learn more about Ideal JHU, please follow us on our Facebook page, Ideal JHU, or on Instagram at ideal_JHU. Thank you guys so much for coming tonight. We hope you have a great rest of the evening, and remember to go out and vote.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you guys.
Thank you.